You ever notice that what you believe, you tend to experience? That your thoughts, even the unconscious ones, have a way of sculpting your reality. This is why we're kicking off a dedicated 3-part series on the power of beliefs, because understanding them is foundational to consciously leading others. Over the next few episodes, we're going to explore how beliefs are formed, how they influence your leadership, and how to update them when they're no longer serving you. Here's the thing. We're not just talking about mindset hacks and positive affirmations. We're talking about the core architecture of your life and your leadership. Beliefs are powerful. They shape how we see ourselves, show up in the world, engage trust, respond to others, and what we think is possible shapes how we execute. Some of these beliefs were chosen, but most, they were inherited, conditioned, or absorbed, often without our permission. And left unexamined, they can get in the way of leading effectively and accomplishing what we aim to achieve. So welcome to Unfazed Under Fire, where we explore what it takes to lead with clarity, consciousness, and courage in a chaotic world. Welcome to the show. I'm David Utts, and I'm here with my co-host Ryan McShane and Anatoly Yakorev, as always. Again, today we're kicking off this 3-part series where we're going to unpack the hidden force of beliefs. So, gentlemen, welcome to the show. Glad to have you here again for this conversation. Before we can shift our beliefs, we need to understand where they come from and how they work. Most of us don't wake up in the morning thinking about our belief systems, but they're running the show behind the scenes. Where do they come from? To me, most of our beliefs are inherited. We grow up in the land of giants, and they're taking care of our food, our roof over our head, and keeping us safe, etc. And we also have this issue of trauma, which I think is sometimes misunderstood. Sometimes people think about trauma, but children deal with sexual abuse, or we have an alcoholic parent, or we're growing up and our parents are stressed. Maybe that they're trying to make ends meet and it's a challenge for them. And that stress tends to bleed off into children. And the thing about children is they tend to believe that when there's stress around them, that they're somehow responsible for that. And we're recognizing that has impact. Yet there's also these mini traumas that we have, and they can have just as much impact on how we lead our lives and experience our lives. And eventually they influence how we lead. And this could just simply be a parent that has a high desire for their children to have it better than them, right? And so they put this subtle pressure on their kids to do really well in school. They want them to get straight A's. And because they know this is your chance, kid. And yet that pressure on the child, while there's a positive outcome of that, it starts having the process that my worth is directly related to my accomplishment and my achievement. So they can get very good at achievement and accomplishment. But what happens is they leave a big part of life out because life becomes about achievement and they miss the rest of life. They're not living holistically, if you will. So any other thoughts on how these beliefs are formed and how they impact us?
Well, there's no question, David, that most of this comes from our family and our family dynamics. And I talk about this a lot in the training that I deliver for organizations. Look at conflict management. How did mom and dad address conflict? Were they yellers? Were they screamers? Were they abusive? Well, then that's probably how you view conflict. And you probably deliver or respond to conflict in a very similar manner. And you also spoke to the trauma effect. I think the old saying, once bitten, twice shy, really embodies exactly what you're talking about. We've created, whether a conscious or unconscious belief related to how we've been affected by something that took place. And then we naturally respond to that by being very wary of those similar types of situations. And also the leadership dynamic. What was the leadership dynamic in your home when you grew up? Was mom the authority? Was dad the authority? That may impact how you view authority figures. And were they authoritarian? Or were they very open and explain things? Or was it just, don't ever question me, kid, just do what I tell you? So we've probably all experienced a little flavor of all of those types of things in our upbringing. But how you integrated that information has an impact on how you shape your beliefs, and then consequently how you behave following that and in your interactions with others. So I think that kind of puts it in a very general framework, and I think most people recognize that when I explain it. but whether or not they're conscious of those things and really examine whether or not that's the way they need to operate, want to operate, and is having the kind of impact that they want as a leader. Those are very different things. And I think that's what this discussion really leads to, is an examination of the beliefs. Why do you believe the way you believe? Is it something that was programmed in you, or is it something you consciously contemplated and said, that just doesn't necessarily cohere with my world perspective? Or maybe it does.
If you look at, for kids, safety, approval, feeling in control of their experience is so important, and it kind of interacts with this amazing survival mechanism that we have as human beings that keeps us safe in situations and keeps us attuned to our environment. And a certain hypervigilance can be developed, for example, in a child around safety or approval, or, what has to happen for mom and dad to love me. And I have a client right now that grew up in a situation where there was no affection, there was no I love yous. It wasn't a bad environment. All the kids are doing great in their careers. I mean, there's a lot of good things that came out of that. But when you have a child that is not getting what they most need, which is love and affection, which is so key to forming our nervous system in a healthy way, that's an example of how a positive experience can be traumatizing because the child didn't get what they needed. I know that's something that you speak to a lot, Anatoly, in our work. We ask our clients, what did you wish you had as a kid that you didn't get? So what is it about that if children don't get their needs met, even though they may be in a quote unquote positive, supportive environment, what does that do to their nervous system? And how does that interact with their structure and creation of beliefs?
Let's start with the fact that we don't really want to revisit any of our childhood traumas. So we grow up and we tend to put it behind us. We always hope that it will never catch up with us and we'll never have to face it again or relive it in this way, which is a big mistake, by the way, because all that stuff that has actually made an impact on the way we were growing up, it still sticks to us as this kind of wet clay, and we carry with us that burden until the very end. And the trouble is, like, to break free from the mold that the trauma has on us takes a leap of faith sometimes, or it takes maybe a way to draw that line in the sand and say, okay, I want to revisit that. I want to put it behind me in a way I know it's been dealt with. But it's interesting because people are talking about deploying various methods of like, okay, well, let's embrace mindfulness. I'll stay in the present. Anything that I existed before in my life will be cut off from my little bubble where I'm now viewing this reality. I'm staying positive. I'm not connected to anything I've experienced before in my life, hoping that this will sever, the linkage that I've built growing up. But unfortunately, like you, Ryan, keep pointing this out, our subconscious mind is vigilant. It remembers everything. Like body keeps the score. Any of those paper cuts that you, David, refer to, they're still pretty much there. We may be oblivious to that, but it's pretty much sitting there. Sometimes it kind of like there's a flash that goes through our minds and we remember things, but we push them out from our focus because we don't want to go back to those days and those times. Now, the toll that the childhood experiences, the whole weight and the burden of that is very significant. If it remains unaddressed, it still lingers on for a very long time. And our position as being wiser and having developed various new traits to be immunized against various experiences, it doesn't really help because it still sits there. It still knocks on our head off and on, reminding like, hey, you haven't dealt with me yet. I'm still here, whether you like it or not. Yeah. So the idea is, there are lots of various mechanisms that have been developed to address that. We don't know to which extent they affect us. But on the neurological level, it still needs to be addressed. And once it's addressed, it provides us with such liberating power. It's just amazing. Like it frees up a lot of new fuel for us to go onwards. That's why it's so important.
One of the things, you can't put lipstick on a pig, right? You can, but it's not going to be any prettier, right? And It goes back to all for good reason and for positive intent. Leadership development people going into organizations, or we have the personal development industry that's grown in leaps and bounds, have these hacks. And one of the hacks you pointed to was mindfulness and meditation. And as one that has really been dedicated to my spiritual path, we have this thing called spiritual bypassing, right? Where you think by jumping in deeply to the practices of meditation and mindfulness, you can clean up the mess. But if you don't look at it, the problem is what goes in must come out. And this is what I talk to my clients all the time. You can't avoid examining these things and where they come from. But as you say, Anatoly, people don't want to do that because there's this monster in the closet. I don't want to open the closet door. I want to forget about it and move on. I got a company to run. I got a family to support. I've got things I want to do in my life. And it doesn't work. And these things are embedded, as you say, in our nervous system. And we're lifting weights with our survival mechanism to get through. And now we're facing times right now where the overwhelm of new information and disinformation and things we don't like and falling structures, the way I used to lead doesn't work anymore in this complex situation. This is exasperating what I believe is a trauma epidemic that we've created. Again, we've all been probably doing our best, right? We're trying to parent our best. We're trying to support our families the best way we can, but we've been misinformed in a certain way about how do you take care of this precious child that just came into your world in a way that doesn't just help them achieve and meet their aspirations, but to meet life in a way that is fulfilling and that supports them in bringing their gifts forward into the world. Because as a parent, I might think, you're not going into the trades, you're going to college. That's one thing. Like, we have this big belief that you have to go to university if you're going to succeed. And that's really well embedded. But then we see what's happening to our universities. Do we really want to send our kids off to some of these universities to be conditioned more in beliefs, right? These universities have a framework of what they believe they should be downloading into those that come to their schools. So they go out and they can make changes in the world they believe they need to make. So we're surrounded by people with their own belief systems that are also influences throughout our life. But what would we say about how much of these fundamental belief systems that are still driving us in the executive suite are formed in these early years? How much influence does that have on one's ability to lead effectively?
Well, the chains that bind us or the wings that help to fly us, how we believe is what we ultimately experience. Henry Ford's famous for his quote, whether you think you can or whether you think you can't, you're right. And there's such wisdom in that simple statement that I think it's important for everybody to be exposed to that quote. I'm a golfer and I enjoy the game phenomenally. I am not very good at it, but I still enjoy it nonetheless because it's that ultimate pursuit of hitting that wonderful shot. One day you're out there and you think, gosh, I'm awful. I just can't do this. And then you hit one good shot and you think you see what you're capable of. And when I stand over a putt, and it might only be a 3 or 4 foot putt, I can tell you I never made a putt where I thought I couldn't make the putt. But when I think I can make the putt, the percentages of me making that putt increase substantially. And I know that's a silly example, but maybe some of our executives that are listening to this are golfers as well and know exactly what I'm talking about.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, that's the power of belief. It allows what we believe is possible to unfold, going back to Ford's quote. And it's so important. If you look at the ontology of language, which I studied to get ready to be a coach, language creates our reality. And that language is most powerfully embedded in our beliefs. What we think is possible is where we're going to orient our action. Or if we think I have to control everything in order to make things happen, that's not just subtly guiding us. That influences the way we lead others. The other thing about this is these beliefs often masquerade as our personality. And I hear this a lot with my clients. Well, that's just the way I am. So if that's the truth, that's just the way I am, that's a belief that drives everything.
Yeah, David, I grew up in a time where basically the answer to everything was do it harder. And that is indicative of what I experienced. Just work harder. If you work hard, everything will work out all right. It was always harder, harder. And I think it was based on this notion that kids these days are just lazy beans. They just need to try harder and do things harder. And it glazes over the notion of what we're talking about today. It's not harder because you're just going to get more of what you had before. It's really standing back and looking at and examining what you're attempting to do. I can try to swing the golf club harder in order to hit the ball better, but typically that fails miserably. What I need to do is change my swing and do something a little bit different in the mechanics, like Anatoly was talking about. The mechanics are so important of what we do. That's a notion that we have to recognize. I grew up in an environment, and I'll vulnerably use myself as an example, where it was, I sensed a conditional love. You know, it was based on achievement, based on certain behaviors. And I think a lot of people grew up in that kind of environment too. So I think you'll resonate and recognize that. And also there was a great deal of criticality. There was recognition of, oh, don't do it this way. Don't do that. Don't do that. You didn't do it well enough. And I think that, kind of being a teaser for the story at the end of this podcast, that idea of perfectionism comes from those experiences as we grow up. We're trying to, once again, get what we need from a love standpoint. So we think that if we are perfect, then we will get everything that we need in response to that. And I can't wait till you tell that story, because I think it's so apropos for this conversation.
Well, I mean, going back to your sports analogy, it's a great place to go. Golf is one of the great places where your beliefs, and I'm sure that's part of your golf lessons, like, what are you telling yourself before you hit the shot? I go back to one of my favorite books when I was early in my leadership development was Tim Galway's Inner Game of Tennis. And it wasn't just about tennis. It was about what we're speaking about. That our external reality, the buildings and the cars and the people aren't changed by it necessarily, but the way that we lean into life and experience life is all starts from the inside out. And it's almost as if we project a reality out that we then believe is true and it's not questioned. And habits are something you do over and over again and no longer question. And that's why we do want to form good habits. And they say for 30 days, you do something, you get into a habit because your nervous system is adjusted to that. And now it's the new normal. And so we know that intuitively, because if we want to change something, we know we have to put energy, focus, effort into it. And that energy, effort, and focus is not natural at the beginning. It's hard. I don't feel like going to the gym today, but I know if I don't, I'm going to go back into the habit that had me before, and I'm going to end up sitting on the couch for the next week. So we know intuitively that we need to reinforce these things. To Anatoly's point earlier, we don't want to open Pandora's box. So that's the dilemma. And I'm not saying that we're asking everybody to go on the couch and start, exploring these things, but in a certain way we are. But leaders today don't have time to do that, and let alone have to deal with something old that's uncomfortable. We want to make sure this ground is set well about where beliefs come from, the idea that early adaptive beliefs become maladaptive later on. That's the amazing thing about our survival mechanism. The beliefs that are formed that I have to be perfect in order for me to get approval, or I have to make sure that I'm playing small and look small in this environment to be safe, or I have to take control of situations because my parents were alcoholics or one of my parents was alcoholics, and if I don't, I'm toast. Those saved us in a certain way. That was a survival mechanism doing its job, and we were protected by those things. And yet we don't realize that if we don't address that, that's pretty fundamental to who we are, and it becomes part of our personality. Right?
And I think that in order for this information that we're sharing with our audience today to really impact them, there needs to be a level of openness to this. And what I mean by that is oftentimes we have as our biggest barrier our egos. I can figure it out. I can control it. I can take care of it. I can work harder and make it all happen and things of that nature. And so there's not that willingness to be vulnerable. There's not that willingness to open up and examine why we think the way we think. I had an executive come to me recently for coaching purposes, and in our initial call, she told me all about her background and her experiences and her hardships and things of that nature. And once I started kind of scratching at those elements of what she shared with me, she immediately bottled up and said, I don't want to be on the couch here. I just want to get to the next level in terms of my career. And she could not see the connection between her inner state and getting to that next level in her career were the two same things. They were the barriers that held her back. And so I kind of stepped back and said, okay, well, I can address you as I do with most of my career clients that I coach. And we can go through a personality assessment, and we can go through a career interest inventory, and we can go through a values interest inventory, and we can apply all these different assessments to you, and then we can discuss it from that standpoint. But I have a more immediate way to address the things that you need by talking about the things that you've already just shared with me. And immediately when I inquire about that, you've exhibited the desire to kind of, whoa, wait a second, let's put the brakes on here and not go in that direction. I just need to be here. Well, not recognizing that in order to get where you want to go, we're going to have to address those things. We're going to have to break those chains that bind you and keep you stuck in where you are. So that's an important recognition for all of our audiences. There needs to be a level of authenticity, courage, and openness to examine these things to get to that next level. And I guarantee every one of our listeners would be astounded at how that frees them to not just take incremental steps, but to take huge leaps and who they are and what they can accomplish and the impact that they can have in the world, not only in their goals, but for other people.
So true. I mean, and what your client was exhibiting was a protective mechanism that was saying, don't go here. I look at Robert Schultz's internal family systems that has been creating is now one of the most evidence-based psychological therapy approaches in the world because it works much faster than talk therapy or some of the other modalities we've used in the past. And what Robert says is that we all have multiple personalities. It's not a disorder. It's a disorder when it's getting in the way of your life. But we have these parts that have instructions. When you cross this security barrier and the red light starts spinning and going off, and this part of you steps forward to handle the situation. So that was a part of that woman that said, warning, we don't talk about that. We could just do our personality assessment and did our resume tightened up and look at our strategy for looking for the job. And it's like, that's when police just come forward like that. So it's like I don't think it's, but people don't want to go there because it's just a little uncomfortable or it doesn't make sense. These are literally our parts coming forward to protect us. And again, this is where the maladaption comes in, at our own cost. And you're also right that we talked about organizational structures and the way that what executives are dealing with at a high state of alert right now. And now we're asking them to be vulnerable. But that's actually what they have to do.
Yeah, and it's not lost on me that high state of alert is ultimately what creates that burnout that we talk about too often. If we're hypervigilant and constantly scanning the environment for those threats, that's exhausting, absolutely exhausting. Whether you're in a leadership role or,
It steals your energy. It steals your energy, right? Yeah. I mean, I look at my own self, my own experience, Again, I had everything I needed as a kid. I got fed. I had Christmas presents. I got birthday presents. My parents made sure I did my homework. But there was this way that I was in the household that didn't compute to them. And I was resisting. I was a bit of a rebel even as a kid. That's the personality that came out of the womb, right? That's where we are interacting with our personality, with our environment. And in that, there was this subtle message that you're just pie in the sky in the way you think, and you're too much this way. Please, could you tamp that down? And you're thinking too broadly. You have to stay focused. You're really good at relationship. Sales is the career for you. And then the shame really took me over, and it took me years. When it still pops up, but it's not an issue for me anymore. But there's subtle levels to this too. You have the surface level of it you addressed, and there's another level of it because we've been operating out of. And now there's this reinforcing effect that creates layers of the experience, let's say, around shame, where you could take off the top 3 layers, but the core issue that's really driving it all is still there. Could you talk a little bit about that, Anatoly, like these layers of these beliefs that seem to operate in us and how you have to get to the trigger mechanism of that belief, or those other layers are just built on top of that?
Well, it's definitely a challenge because, on one hand, people don't want to revisit that. It's like off limits. It's something that could be discussed with a therapist or a shrink, and whether they get to the bottom of it or whether they won't doesn't really matter. They still have to live with the aftermath of what they have. But
Right.
some people, they're really afraid to identify that maybe most of their belief systems is just trash. Something they learned, something that stuck, and it doesn't hold any value and it no longer serves them. But I'm still
Right.
afraid to look back. It's like, oh, I'm looking back at my childhood. Oh, I just realized it's a stolen childhood. I haven't experienced what you guys experienced. Those things that you had when you were kids, I didn't have. And I don't want to go there, right? It's not fair if I start matching what, the expectations were versus what I had. You can talk about emotional detachment that some households have for the sake of preserving families, but it still affects kids who grow up in the environment where things are not conducive to their emotional well-being. And then people over time, those layers that they keep recreating, for themselves. Like I'm like growing out of my clothes. I need a bigger size clothes. So I just kind of buy the same type of clothes, just bigger size. My belief systems need to be matched. But I don't even know
Right.
why I have those. Why do I like that color? I don't like that color anymore, but I still cling on to that color because that's the only thing I know. And by the time when you're talking about leaders, when they make decisions in the spur of the moment, most of those decisions are being driven by their childhood traumas or scarcity, whatever they experienced at the time. So that's what
Yeah.
is really the problem, because the multiple layers on top makes it very difficult to penetrate and go down to focus on the original level of trauma that created or generated those multiple layers to cushion the pain over time. So when people kind of ended up having those layers, they don't even understand. Why do I keep hauling that trash with me all the time? Will I ever? Okay, well, I will address that when I retire, when I have more time.
Yeah.
I will address that. When I'm 70, I'll be more comfortable because I won't have my memory anymore. I will have a lot of cognitive decline. I will feel safer addressing those issues. But you're right. All those layers, people just don't want to address that because actually it could be multiple layers of one small thing, just one small thing. Because, once they know that main trigger that they had in their childhoods would make their lives so much easier. Like I know mine. Mine was always been about betrayal by friends or family, being left in the
Hmm.
woods, left like, someplace, or I sometimes would walk away. But I could deal with anything. I really want to have someone cover my back. That's what we all have, wanted, right? But once you really go down to that, it's just only one tiny thing. It's not too bad.
Well, it's interesting you went into ethics and compliance, right? We have to make sure so that people don't get betrayed by trust, right? It's interesting what
Yes.
we do. That shows our profession. I remember my dad, I used to have to go out and pull the weeds. And he would always tell me, you don't get to the root. They're coming back. And I would be so frantic to get to the root, and I'd be so frustrated with dandelion roots because they never came up. But that's what we're talking about here. If you're constantly pruning the tree, you're not getting rid of the belief. I think we've done a pretty good job of talking about how beliefs are formed. The next question becomes, how are they playing out in real time in our decisions, our relationships? So let's dive into that a little bit, how beliefs become filters for how we interpret reality. I think we did touch on some of that, but there's a truism, what we believe we receive, right? And, going back to Henry Ford's comments, you believe you can, you will. If you believe you can't, you won't. Either way, case, it's the way it's going to be. So let's talk a little bit about how that happens. So, certainly indecision making is a key thing for executives. How does that apply? Also, beliefs tend to be ignited under pressure. Like I could be in my best behavior. I have a client of mine says, I have an internal governor, and that governor makes sure that I don't overstep the line. And he's developed this thing to a high degree. I tell him all the time, well, that governor's stealing your energy. It's really amazing you created this internal governor. And he is perceived very positively by others because this internal governor is operating, but there's a cost to that. And that is amazing at creating compensation systems. But when the pressure starts ramping up, those compensation systems collapse depending on the degree of pressure. So when we're making decisions, going back to that, we can be very effective 60% of the time making good decisions. But when all of a sudden our job is in the line, or we're going through a merger and acquisition, or we now are dealing with a new competitive landscape, something changes, we can then go under pressure, and that tends to influence us. So, gentlemen, any thoughts on that? The impact of our beliefs on supporting us in creating what we want or getting in the way of that.
To your point, I think, David, it goes back to when we are in those heightened states of experience, we double down on the most fundamental aspect of who we are and who we believe ourselves to be. And so it goes back to our conditioning, because that's where the protection comes from. And again, what occurred to me while Anatoly was speaking is, if I don't believe this, whatever this is, then ultimately, who am I? And that's a scary notion, because it creates a void for that person to say, well, if I'm not this, who am I? Whoa. And so some people might say, well, then I lose all sense of myself. And that may be very scary for them. Or others might say, hey, that's freedom. Now I get to redefine who I am. And I would love to be able to position people, and try to position people towards that freedom of creating a new scaffolding. I love that terminology, and it came through in a book that I'm reading by Dr. Ken Chapman called The Leader's Code. And he talks about that scaffolding of belief that we end up creating. And I think that's what you're referring to as well, David. And sometimes we have to recognize that scaffolding needs to be disassembled and re-erected in a way that better serves us, because that ultimately delivers based on those executive decisions that we have to make on a daily basis. If my scaffolding is skewed in this one way or shape or form, then it creates an impact on how I make decisions and how I articulate myself, communication being such a critical component of how we lead, and whether or not that resonates with people in a way that they can hear it. And all of that, as you had mentioned, impacts the speed of trust. And if we don't have the speed of trust built into what we're doing, and Ken Chapman talks about that as well in his book, then we become grossly inefficient. We constantly look over our shoulders. And I think that's endemic of most of what we experience in corporate America today. There is a great deal of lack of trust. There's very much an us against them notion and mentality that perpetuates a lot of these organizational environments. Whether it be person to person or labor to management. We know better and we're going to tell you what to do. And there's this one-way communication that exists. And when I say jump, your only response is how high. There's no kind of debate or discussion about what's going to work best for the stakeholder. And that's phenomenal to think about, that some organizations still survive in spite of themselves. And it just fascinates me that that's the case. Yeah, I know you've seen it, David, in our conversation.
Yeah. You're talking about trust. I mean, there is an embedded belief about trust in all of us. Some people just give it away. Doesn't matter what you do, I'm going to trust you until you reach this mountaintop or this crescendo moment, and now I don't trust you. But I've never talked to you about that. Yeah. We don't realize that trust is a relationship thing. Yes, it has to do with your integrity and follow through and all that. And in order for us to trust, we have to talk about some expectations around that. And what has to happen for us to trust each other? If you don't have that fundamental conversation, then other people, you have to do tons of things to get their trust. As I say, trust but verify. You have to have a certain degree of trust, but it goes back to you have to be rigorous in creating commitments with each other. And you have to understand what the conditions of satisfaction of the one that's making the request has of you. And that other person is also responsible for thinking that through themselves. And most of the time we don't. And commitments is where the rubber meets the road. But people don't want to be rigorous about commitments. And again, it goes back to beliefs and trauma. Because I'm really demanding that of you. You're a senior person, and I'm in the room saying, well, what has to happen for you to be satisfied that's done in that way? I don't want to ask that question. They think I should know that, which is a belief, right? And the other thing is our beliefs have impact on how we engage others, is what we're saying here. In 2003, Harvard Business Review did this big article on the Pygmalion effect. The Pygmalion effect is, depending on your expectations of others, is how they'll perform. What? No, they're supposed to perform because they know how to do it. But there's this understanding that language is 97% nonverbal. And I often say it's like when you go to a foreign country, no matter how slow you say, where is the bathroom, if they don't understand you,
that's right.
It doesn't matter. I mean, you have to You have to jump up and down, do things to show them that you need to go to the back. So there was this great study in Harvard Business Review in 2003 about the New York Life salespeople. And I know some of you might be familiar with the story, but it's about the Pygmalion effect. And one sales manager was told, man, it's one of the best times you've ever had as a sales manager. We've got 5 salespeople joining your team, and they are superstars. Your numbers are going to go up. You don't have to overmanage them or micromanage them. You just have to give them the lay of the land, inspire them, keep them pumped up. They'll do the rest. And this other sales manager was told, I'm really sorry. You're getting the dregs. But sometimes you have to do the heavy lifting in your career. And we're going to give you these 5 salespeople. We're not sure if they're going to make it. They kind of just made the grade. These life insurance companies will do these major assessments where you come in and get a job like that. They're just kind of passing the grade, but we think they're redeemable. So we're going to give this to you and see what you can do with it. And so these sales managers got these new people on their team. Well, the results were pretty interesting. But the backstory to this is all these salespeople coming in were above average. They were good enough. There was nothing wrong with them. They weren't superstars and they weren't the dregs, right? What happened, obviously, you're going to guess that the sales manager that got these superstars, they overperformed. They did great. And the other people, they were subpar in their results. So what the Pygmalion effect says is that when you have a strong belief about a direct report, again, 97% of communication is nonverbal. You subtly give cues, like when we were kids, like you're too much, right? Or whatever, or you're not working hard enough. And we tend to micromanage them and because we don't believe that they're high performers or we give them space. But as leaders of direct reports, if you're not examining what your assessment of a direct report is, and you can't look at it from a granular, here's exactly what they did that wasn't effective, and give them that direct feedback and coach them. This is why coaching is an important element of leadership. You are sending them subtle messages that is not serving you or them. And we see this all the time. And I know you've seen this, Ryan, in how we do performance reviews is they're good enough, meet expectations. This year they did a little better, exceed expectations. But over time, I'm getting more and more frustrated with this direct report. I'm not giving them any feedback. And then one day I say, you're fired. What? I met expectations. 2 years ago, I exceeded expectations. Again, it goes back to what are we believing? Like, I don't want to put up with incompetence. I assess you as incompetent, which comes from a belief system that you probably did automatically because it goes back to those core beliefs we were as kids. And therefore, I'm not going to communicate with you because, number one, either I shouldn't have to or it's scary for me to communicate and be direct with you.
Yes. There is an example I often use in my training experiences talking about one particular supervisor that had this belief, and I don't know where she got this belief. But this belief was, if you make this amount of money, I shouldn't have to tell you what to do. And I'm like, where did that come from? So she was holding her employees accountable to expectations that she never communicated to them to begin with. And she had this thought, well, if you make this amount of money, I shouldn't even have to tell you those expectations. Like, what? Are they just supposed to divine these understandings and expectations from you? It did not make sense whatsoever. And that's obviously a real trust factor. I honestly, my heart goes out to those employees that operated under this supervisor because they had literally been abused in relation to being held accountable to expectations that they had no understanding of whatsoever. And it kind of goes back to an abusive parent where you're smacked and you don't even know why you were smacked. And they don't explain why you were smacked. And then you're constantly hyperly vigilant as to how can I avoid getting smacked again. And you mentioned before, and I just want to speak to this very quickly, David, how do you create trust in teams? And there was something that I used to do every time I led a major committee or project initiative is I would establish with that group what I called rules of the road. And it was all about how do we want to operate with one another? There was logistical components, to it as well. When do we want to meet? How long do we want to meet? But more important than any of that was how do we want to interact with one another? What kind of experience do you want to get out of this? When we disagree, and I can guarantee we're going to disagree, and I hope we disagree. So we demystified the conflict kind of notion of, conflict's bad. No, I'm hoping we have conflict because that ultimately sharpens our skills and what we're able to bring to the table. What's all of that going to look like? And so we would spend the entire first meeting creating rules of the road. And then we would revisit those rules of the road in the first 5 minutes of every meeting I had after that with that same committee to reinforce those kind of things. And then we would also even look back on it and say, well, how are we doing related to these rules of the road? Are there things that we need to sharpen a little bit or hold each other to a greater level of accountability as to what we had expressed? And when that first conflict arises, which it invariably does, I point back to that rules of the road to say, hey, remember, we talked about this. This is something we expected. Let's make sure that we carry out our conflict management style as you guys told me you wanted to deal with this. So that served me very well and served my committees and meetings very well from that standpoint. And I just offer that to the executive audience that's listening.
That's very important education for people understanding. And I do find that a lot of times the leaders resist that process of clarifying their expectations. It's very interesting. But that goes back to the whole challenge we have. I don't have time for that because there has been no self-examination. And this goes back to, this is the cost of these beliefs. These beliefs have tremendous costs. And in fact, the multi-billion-dollar leadership development profession is a compensation system. Now, it's a good one. I'm not saying it's not healthy, but it's a big compensation system for people that haven't done self-examination. It's not their fault, but we keep on layering stuff on top, more stuff that you have to do to make sure you can be effective. Now we're in this tumultuous environment, and we talked in the last show about how it's beginning to reveal itself in ways that are not good. We've got sharp, talented C-suite executives saying, I'm done. I can't do this anymore. I can't keep up, right? And so there's a real cost in this lack of examination. And the question becomes, what do we do about it, right? We have this kind of glue of beliefs that's holding us together, and it's starting to not be effective anymore, or it's starting to bring out all the uglies, if you will. Any thoughts that you have about this, Anatoly, that you wanted to share?
Well, I think it's really important to basically state the obvious. When you operate in a very stressful environment, you fall back on your belief systems. And if your belief systems are not good, they are not serving you well. And they're not serving you well, you go into this nosedive, you crash and burn. It's a very simple story, but nobody wants to revisit those ugly monsters under their bed or in their closet when they were kids, right? Because I want to go, look, I'll just give you a good example. I have observed a lot of hard-nosed BP executives getting into this stupid verbal match, and this is exactly when those things would be revealed. If I was bullied when I was a kid, even though I'm a vice president right now, I get reduced verbally to nothing right there because I fall back into my role when I used to be a kid. And even though I hold enough power now, it doesn't serve me very well because when I'm a stressed out bunny, I operate with my reptilian system. It's 10% of my entire, energy available to me. So I'm reduced to that. And when I'm pointed out later on, well, I could have done better. I don't even understand what you're talking about. See, that's the problem. That's a huge disconnect. So when stress goes up, the burnout goes up, and there's a lot of trash behind, accumulated over decades, never addressed. That's a recipe for disaster. So what do? Do we address that? Do we pretend like, okay, well, that's the part of my life. I don't want to go back. Maybe it's nothing. Because I'm as an adult looking back at all the stuff I had before, it doesn't mean anything to me anymore. But they forget that my entire personal identity has been built around it. And now I'm operating from that power base, which sits on my childhood expectations, the way I was dealing with that. Yeah. So it's as simple as that.
It goes back to you can't put lipstick on a pig, right? You could try, but it's not going to work. Ryan, what did you say?
Well, I just want to give a quick illustration or story related to what Anatoly was saying, because I think it just exemplifies it. The belief about authority and what you are as an authority or leader in your role. I remember very clearly, and I may have shared this story before with our audience. I've told this story so many times in trainings, how I was a director of human resources, and I was called down to a division chief's office about a policy issue. And she had shared with me that an employee was challenging her on a particular policy issue. And I said, well, let's go ahead and look at this policy and take a look. And I said, well, as a matter of fact, from what you've shared with me, that employee is correct in their assumption and perspective on that policy issue. And you could have knocked me over with a feather in terms of the supervisor's response. She said, well, I can't let her think she won. And I said, you can't let her think she won? She said, yeah, that's exactly right. So obviously her belief about authority was authority always has to be correct, and it would compromise who she is as an authority figure to admit that that employee was accurate in their interpretation and her estimation of that policy was incorrect. She could not humble herself or be vulnerable enough to say, yeah, in fact, you're exactly right. Let's go ahead and proceed as you want, because that was against what she desired as well. So there was a desire that was in conflict with the policy. There was a belief about her position as an authority figure that was in conflict with what is true leadership. So it was, I love, these are painful experiences that I've had and witnessed throughout my career, but I love them in hindsight because they make such great stories as to illustrate what not to do as a leader.
Well, again, how did you learn, or what belief system is driving that in you, right? And there's pain there and compassion for me, like somewhere that came honestly, right? So, yeah, and yet the repercussions and implications of what you just said on the employee and her stance on that, kind of insanity in a certain way.
I'll tell you that employee resigned within 6 months.
So I think we've covered some really good ground. I want to go into our last kind of section of this show today. We've looked at how beliefs can shape our leadership and why some of them need to be upgraded, obviously. We looked at what the implications are of not doing that, as we've all spoken about. But how do we make those changes effective and make it stick at the level of identity? One of the most powerful one is how we think of ourselves. So that's kind of where it goes back to where the resilient leadership method comes in. And I want to talk about how that helps leaders rewire those beliefs from the inside out. And when I talk about what I love about the resilient leader method, again, is it's a very clean method. It doesn't mess with our client's psyche. It's a very empowering process because it asks you to consider two primary things. What do you want to let go of that are no longer serving you? And what do you want to lean in and create? Now, from that perspective, I know, Anatoly, you say that we don't change leaders' beliefs, and that goes back to the clean system. We don't go in and tinker with your brain and your nervous system and let's just pull this out and see what happens. None of that's going on. We're not like pulling what's that? I can't remember the name of that game where you're pulling the
Jenga.
Out. Jenga, yeah. It's like we're not playing Jenga with your brain. And at the same time, we are addressing some fundamental beliefs, because when you release, trauma, you're also extracting those beliefs and making room for new ones. Is that right, Anatoly? How would you describe how the resilient leader method attends to the beliefs based on what the executive wants to let go of and bring more into their experience?
Well, it's fair to say that when I'm not looking to tinker with anyone's belief systems, because they have the right to stick to their own beliefs and values, and it's their character traits and stuff like that. But let's look at where the belief systems reside. Actually, they reside pretty much in the same space that Ryan loves talking about, a subconscious mind. Oh, and behold, as to a sweet spot where all the treasures that we have as human beings, they lurk right there. And the only light that could be shown on those uglies is the theta brainwaves, 4 to 8 hertz brainwaves that actually can lay bare all of that stuff. So therefore, during the process, when people go in resonance with me, technically all that stuff can arise to the surface, and it's kind of sitting there, almost like begging to be addressed. So I tell people, you can redesign yourself the way you want it, because that's available to you right now. I'm not doing anything to you. You identify your traumas, your fears, any painful experience you've had, and you redesign what you want to have, including your belief systems. Again, you'll be doing that yourself. I'm not adding anything. I'm not saying anything. But the way you want to shape it, That's how it will be. And this is the beauty of it, because I just have to set the groundwork for that resonance to be there, and then all of that could be removed in a matter of seconds. Again, it's an interesting thing because you can deal both with the negative and the positive at the same time. So, but like we talked about, the fact that if our personal identity has been sitting on some false foundation of those beliefs that we develop being kids, trying to portray ourselves to be better for our parents, to our friends. So that means that the entire system gets addressed. But the beauty of that is, if you get to decide what to remove, that's going to create a chain reaction. I remove one painful experience. Anything that's been connected to that painful experience over decades in my life gets pulled out like those roots that you, David, you were struggling with. But that's the beauty of it. If I just point out one thing, which actually had those roots going down all the way to my childhood, it gets pulled out and it's gone. Now, when you deal with the void that creates as a result, because a lot of people may reel from this mild shock, because once that is addressed, what do I do now? But then that's the thing. That's what you want to be. You will slip it right in because that's what you want to be going forward. So again, the whole point that belief systems sit in the theta world, in that theta pocket of our brain oscillations, is a huge deal because you don't have to chase them all over the place. Everything sits in the same sweet spot. And all you have to do is just have to say, like, okay, it's up for grabs. You revisit that. You call the shots. You decide what needs to go, what needs to stay, what you want to slipstream in right there. So you go forward being liberated from the junk that you have accumulated.
Right. Well, as the preparation stage for the reset has become a very important element in our work. It's almost like the metaphor I use is you're walking into this room of your life experience. And there's these dark corners over here that you nip into the heels. And then there's these piles of gold coins and rubies and gems on this side. So I want you to go in and look at those things in the dark corners that you realize have been nipping at your heels and causing you to behave and take actions and resist, that are getting in your way and stealing your energy and creating reactivity in you. And when you pull those to the side, think about what you would like and look at the other side of the room and pick out the gems and the gold coins and the beautiful other things, but other things that you would like, and pull them together in these two lists, my letting go list and what we call our joy list. And that's what you bring into your session with Anatoly. So you are making the choice, and there's nothing else that's going to be addressed other than what you choose. So that's what I love about the process. And I want to kind of revisit a story specifically to this because it pulls it all together what we were talking about today, and specifically using that metaphor and what you just said kind of puts an exclamation point on this. And I want to go back to a story I shared several shows ago because it's really based on today's focus on beliefs. And again, I talked about Amy, who was this high-performing CFO, had the skills, intelligence, and drive. She had natural leadership instincts, but she also had this deeply ingrained belief that everything had to be perfect. And that belief served her in her career. But when she gets to the C-suite level at this high-tech company, she was required to engage the board more. And if you remember, the CEO said to Amy, he saw her brilliance, and he said, you could be my replacement. Yet, to prove you're ready, you have to get over yourself and show up more authentically and more curious in these board meetings. And she would show up at these meetings being too careful, trying too hard, and her perfectionism was giving in the way. And there's an underlying belief that I have to be perfect in order for me to be okay. And she would just come across overly rigid and tightly scripted. And she just lacked this ease and comfort level. Everything you're saying is right, but I feel a little bit tight when I'm talking to you, right? So I got her to engage the resilient leader method. And after she engaged the reset, something shifted right away. That intense need to be perfect dropped away because she said, I want to let go of this idea that I have to be perfect in the preparation. And she started showing up just more naturally, more curious, more fun actually. And especially in the board interactions, instead of being thrown off by questions, she would not be frozen by the questions. She would lean in and ask more questions, and she would do it in a way that was building rapport with others. And it wasn't just that her delivery changed, it was her energy. The board felt her presence more. And her CEO noticed it too. And during her first presentation post-reset, after the presentation, the board CEO went up to her and says, I don't know what you did, Amy, but That presentation was off the charts impeccable, and you had the room. You owned the room. And not long after that, he announced her as a successor and began the transition process, starting by first naming her as COO of the company. Again, when she got ready for the reset, she said one of the things she wanted to let go of was when she was a kid, having this sense that she had to be perfect and that she desired just to be a kid and be authentic and relaxed and have fun. And one of the big phrases for her as a reminder of this is, nope, how can I instill fun in this? And that's become a mantra for her. And when she does that, it almost shifts. Like sometimes these old memories will come back to people after they do the reset because it's still in our brain. We still remember things. We haven't lost our memory of them. And yet you can easily trigger back into the reset state by triggering yourself in a certain way to remember what it was like. And she does this, and it really has made a huge difference in how people interact with her and how she engages others. Anything you want to say there?
I was just going to say that's just so powerful. And I love that triggering thought that she has. How can I still have fun in this? Because I think that we get so caught up in the stresses of life and the difficulties of life. And there's a concept out there in the military world, embrace the suck. And I think that's a big part of what I hear. How can I still have fun in this? How can I embrace the suck? And I love what you shared there, David, because I think that's so powerful for the audience to hear.
Here's where affirmations work, right? Because you don't have that system in you that's going to resist the affirmation. The affirmation is now reminding you of who you are. That's accessible to you. The reset removes the roots. I wish I had you around when I was pulling dandelions at Anatoly. I could have done a better job. So as we move to the close of the show today, any words, final words from you two about this whole topic that we've addressed today that you wanted to share before we close out for the day?
Personally, I just think it goes without saying that how powerful beliefs really are and how much they guide how we view the world around us and how we interact with others. And I think that you've done an excellent job in just kind of framing that conversation. I look forward to our subsequent conversations on it because it is such a deep and wide topic that is so impactful that it's important to really address this on different levels so that people can hear it where they are. So that's what we're doing in these conversations, is trying to meet people where they are by sharing these illustrations and examples of beliefs and how they show up for us so that you can resonate with it in a way that understands, I'm ready to level up. What's that look like? I've heard a story that is my story. So from that identification standpoint, I need to reach out and think about how I can level up. And those are the offerings that I know David and Anatoly have for the audiences. So I'm excited about contributing to that process.
As to your point, Ryan, we talked a lot about consciousness is the primary underlying operating system. But if you think about why beliefs are so powerful, they're the primary applications that come off of that operating system that allow you to be in this world and navigate this world. So they're related. This whole conversation we had about consciousness in the last three shows is related now. Now we're moving up to how does consciousness create reality? It creates reality through some navigational systems, which are your beliefs, right? So, yeah. Any final words from you, Anatoly, for today?
Well, it's a very interesting topic because for a lot of people, their belief systems and anything that helps create their personal identity is like nobody wants to touch it. Out of fear of discovering that it may not be serving them well, because then if you discover that, it means you have to do something about it. But if you don't know what to do about it, then you're stuck. And then it's like, look, love me, warts and all. I'm maybe not the best person in the world, but that's who I am. And I'm not going to do anything about it. So to a lot of people, it's a huge challenge because consciousness is also related to that. If you're a highly conscious person, you don't really care. Okay, big deal. I mean, like I had a bit of a screwed up childhood and I learned things wrong, but I can always fix them up so I can show up to the world and look a bit better. So all of that stuff is interconnected. And what we're doing, we keep revisiting each element and hopefully making it a bit more, a bit easier for people to process.
Thank you very much. As Ryan said, beliefs are powerful and they can either trap us into old stories or unlock a future that we've longed to create for ourselves. That's how powerful we are. And today we just cracked open how beliefs are formed and how they quietly shape the outcomes we experience personally and with others, as well as professionally. So if today's conversation sparked something, especially the latter part of it, and you success that some of your beliefs are out of sync with where you want to go, this is the time to reach out. Resilient leadership method is the most powerful tool I know to reset your beliefs into a form that will help you achieve what you want to achieve and live the kind of life you want to live. And it might be just the upgrade your leadership needs. So reach out and we can talk about how it might apply to you. Now, we'll continue our series in the next show by focusing on when our beliefs become our burdens. That'll be the focus of the next show. We touched on that again today. We're going to drill down a little bit more on that and look more at the structure of beliefs and how they do that. During that show, we'll look at adaptive beliefs, beliefs formed from trauma cast that wet blanket on you and causes mischief. Until next time, notice what you keep believing. It might be the very thing shaping what you keep experiencing. This is David Utts, Leadership Alchemist, signing off and wishing you a great rest of your day.